In 1918, a letter arrived on the desk of the Australian Prime Minister. It had been written in secret by men who believed they were about to complete the greatest private land transaction in the history of the world. The land in question covered 107,000 square miles. To give you a sense of what that means, it was larger than the entire United Kingdom. All of it, every acre, was owned by one man. His name was Sidney Kidman. The story of Sidney Kidman does not begin with wealth. It begins with a one-eyed boy, a broken family, and a single shilling. Sidney Kidman was born on May the 9th, 1857 in Rosenthal, South Australia. He was the fifth of 7 children. His father was a farmer, not a successful one. The family lived with a particular anxiety of people who are always one bad season from nothing. Sidney understood this from the time he could understand anything. When he was 5 years old, he lost the sight in his left eye. The cause is recorded differently in different accounts. Some say a childhood accident, others an infection. What is certain is that from that point forward, Sidney Kidman saw the world through one eye, and somehow he saw more of it than almost anyone who came before him. In 1870, when Sidney was 13 years old, his father died. The family had nothing, less than nothing. There were debts. Sidney made a decision that most 13-year-olds would be incapable of making. He left. He packed what little he owned into a swag, put a single shilling in his pocket, 1 shilling worth less than a cup of tea, and walked out of the family home in the direction of Kapunda. He was heading for the cattle stations of the outback. He had no contacts, no family connections, no plan beyond the belief, a 13-year-old's blind, unreasonable belief, that if he worked hard enough, the land would eventually give something back. He had no idea he was right. Kidman found work at a cattle station near Kapunda. He was 13. He started at the bottom, which, on a cattle station in 1870s Australia, was very far down. He cleaned, he mended fences, he did the jobs no one else wanted, he slept outside when there was no room inside, he ate what was left, and he watched. This is something that every person who knew Sidney Kidman remarked upon: the way he watched, the way he studied the land, the cattle, the routes the drovers took. He was absorbing information with the patience of someone who understood that knowledge out here was the only currency that didn't run out. He understood that the difference between a cattle drive that succeeded and one that failed wasn't strength or speed or even luck. It was water. In a continent as dry and merciless as Australia, water was everything. Water determined where cattle could walk, how far they could travel, whether they arrived at market alive or dead. Cattle that arrived dead were worthless. Cattle that arrived healthy were worth a fortune. Sidney Kidman, at 16 years old, had already begun to understand that the key to owning Australia's cattle industry was not owning the cattle, it was owning the water. By 1876, Kidman was 19. He had saved enough money to buy his first horse and his first head of cattle. A small mob he purchased cheaply because they were underweight and half dead from drought. He nursed them back to health, then he sold them at a profit. It sounds simple. It was not simple. It required an almost uncanny understanding of what an animal needed and a patience that most men twice his age did not possess. But it worked, and Sidney Kidman never forgot what it felt like, that first profit, that first moment of proof that his theory was correct. By the early 1880s, Sidney Kidman had become a reasonably successful cattle dealer. He was not yet rich, but he was, by the standards of the Australian outback, comfortable. He owned a small property. He had a reputation for fair dealing and an uncanny eye for cattle. But Kidman was thinking bigger. Much bigger. The problem with the Australian cattle industry in the 1880s was this: Australia was enormous, and the people who needed to buy cattle, the meatworks, the butchers, the export companies, were all on the coast. Getting cattle from the inland stations to the coast was a journey of hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles. It took months, and the cattle that arrived, and if they arrived, were exhausted, underweight, and worth a fraction of what they had been worth when they left. Every cattle station owner in Australia accepted this as a fact of life. The interior was far from the coast. Cattle lost weight on long drives. That was simply the reality of the business. Sidney Kidman did not accept it. What Kidman had observed over years of riding the country, watching the land, studying the routes, was that water sources across the interior of Australia were not random. They were connected, not obviously, not on any map. But if you knew where to look, there was a chain of waterholes, rivers, and creeks that ran, with some gaps, from the far north of Queensland all the way down through the center to the markets of South Australia. A chain. If you owned the land along that chain, or more specifically, the water along that chain, you could move cattle thousands of miles without them losing significant weight. You could deliver cattle to market in peak condition. And peak condition cattle in the 1880s Australian market were worth 2 to 3 times the price of exhausted cattle. This was Sidney Kidman's theory, and he was about to spend 30 years making it real. In 1886, Kidman purchased his first significant property, Owen Springs Station in the Northern Territory. It was not the most productive station in Australia. It was not even close to the most productive, but it sat on a chain of waterholes that pointed south, and it was the beginning. Over the next 2 decades, Kidman would buy properties the way a chess player moves pieces, not for their immediate value, but for their position. Every purchase was a calculated step toward completing the chain. He bought stations that were failing, stations that other men had abandoned because they were too dry, too remote, too difficult. Kidman bought them cheap. Then he put water infrastructure in, dams, bores, tanks, and connected them to the chain. He was not just buying land, he was engineering a supply route across an entire continent. People who dined with him noted that he ate simply, dressed plainly, and could discuss the price of cattle in any district of Australia from memory. He was also, by all accounts, deeply kind. He was known across the outback for a practice that no other station owner of his scale practiced. He allowed struggling drovers to water their cattle at his bores for free. No charge, no paperwork. In a country where water was survival, this was not a small thing. Some historians have argued this was simply good business. In 1906, Sidney Kidman owned more land than any private individual in the history of Australia. The precise figures are almost impossible to comprehend. At his peak, Kidman controlled approximately 107,000 square miles of Australia, 56 stations, hundreds of thousands of cattle, supply routes that stretched from the Gulf of Carpentaria in the north to the meatworks of Adelaide in the south. To move cattle from the northernmost point of his network to the southernmost without ever crossing land he didn't own took approximately 6 months. 6 months of continuous movement from station to station, waterhole to waterhole, along a chain that Kidman had spent 20 years assembling, one property at a time. The scale of the operation required a workforce to match. When the First World War began in 1914, Australia faced a problem it had not anticipated. The British government needed meat, enormous quantities of meat, to feed armies on the Western Front, to supply the Royal Navy, to sustain an empire at war on multiple fronts, and they needed it fast. The Australian government turned to Kidman. He was, by 1914, the only man in the country with a supply network capable of delivering cattle to the coast in the quantities and time frames the war required. Over the course of the war, Kidman supplied beef contracts worth millions of pounds to the British government, effectively providing a significant portion of the protein that fed the Allied forces. He was knighted in 1921, Sir Sidney Kidman, the boy who left home with a shilling, but there is a chapter of Sidney Kidman's story that almost no one knows. A chapter that was buried in a government file for 85 years. And it tells us something about Kidman and about Australia that changes the way you understand everything that came before it. In 1915, as the war was consuming the world, Sidney Kidman, by then the wealthiest landowner in Australian history, began quietly negotiating the sale of his empire, not to another Australian, not to the government, to a foreign syndicate. The syndicate involved British financial interests with significant connections to American capital. The proposed sale price was in excess of £10 million, an almost incomprehensible sum in 1915. And the Australian government had no idea it was happening. When Prime Minister Billy Hughes was informed, through a source that has never been publicly named, he acted immediately. What followed was 3 years of legal and diplomatic maneuvering, conducted almost entirely in secret, as the Australian government worked to prevent the sale of more than 100,000 square miles of their own continent to foreign interests. A memo written by a senior official in the Prime Minister's department stated that the sale of the Kidman network to foreign ownership would represent a strategic vulnerability of the First Order, equivalent to the surrender of the inland water supply of the continent to interests unknown and potentially hostile. The sale was blocked. Kidman, for reasons that remain unclear, perhaps patriotism, perhaps the realization that the government would never allow it regardless, did not fight the decision. He kept his empire, and the file was sealed. Sidney Kidman married Isabel Brown Wright in 1885. They had 4 daughters and 1 son. The historical record on his personal life is thin, partly because Kidman was intensely private, and partly because the men who wrote Australia's history in the early 20th century were not especially interested in the domestic lives of their subjects. There is another cost that must be acknowledged. The land that Sidney Kidman bought, station by station, waterhole by waterhole, was not empty land. It had never been empty. The interior of Australia, when Kidman began acquiring his properties in the 1880s, was home to Aboriginal nations who had occupied, managed, and known that land for tens of thousands of years. The pastoral lease system that made Kidman's acquisition legally possible had been designed to extinguish those connections, not through warfare primarily, but through the machinery of law. A land you cannot legally own can be legally taken from you. The history of Kidman's empire cannot be told honestly without this context. The stations he bought were cheap, partly because they were remote and harsh, but they were also cheap because the displacement of the people who had lived on them had already been accomplished by others before Kidman arrived. He did not invent this system. He did not design it, but he benefited from it enormously, and the men and women who had been displaced by it, many of whom then worked on the very stations built on their country for wages that ranged from minimal to nothing, deserve to be part of this story. Their names are not in the National Archives file. They are rarely in any file, but the land remembers them. By the 1920s, Sidney Kidman was in his 60s. He had been knighted. He had survived 2 droughts that would have broken lesser men. He had seen the cattle industry transform around him, refrigerated ships, rail networks, the early trucks beginning to replace the droving routes he had spent his life building. He adapted. He always adapted, but there were losses he could not adapt to. His son, Walter, the heir to the empire, the person Kidman had quietly built everything toward, died in 1935. 3 years before Sidney himself, Sidney Kidman died on September the 2nd, 1935. He was 78 years old. He died at Kapunda, the same town he had walked towards 65 years earlier with a single shilling and 1 working eye. There is something in that symmetry that feels almost deliberate, as though the land had been holding that ending in reserve all along. What Sidney Kidman left behind is both easier and harder to measure than it might appear. The easy part: his estate was valued at approximately £2 million at the time of his death, the equivalent of several $100 million today. The Kidman pastoral empire continued to operate under family management for decades after his death, eventually passing to a trust and, in 2016, being sold to a consortium that included Gina Reinhardt's Hancock Prospecting. The harder part: what do you make of a life like this? A boy with nothing, in a landscape that offered nothing, who looked at the most inhospitable continent on Earth and decided it was not a barrier. It was a map. His network, the chain of water and land that he spent 30 years assembling, was not just a business. It was a piece of infrastructure that shaped how the interior of Australia was settled, supplied, and connected to the outside world. The routes his drovers used became, in many cases, the routes the roads followed. The bores he sank, many of them still exist, still pumping water from the same underground reservoirs, still sustaining life in places where, without them, there would be none. And the government file, the one that sat in the National Archives for 85 years, the one that described his network as strategically equivalent to the water supply of an entire continent, That file tells us something that perhaps Kidman himself never fully articulated. He had not just built a business. He had built something so essential, so deeply embedded in the body of the country, that the government of Australia could not allow it to pass into foreign hands. A 13-year-old boy with a shilling and a swag had built something the nation could not survive without. Australia is a country that tends to celebrate the loud, the spectacular, the obvious. Sidney Kidman was none of those things. He was a man who understood from the age of 13 that the land rewards patience, that the outback does not give up its secrets to people who are in a hurry, that the only way to move across country this vast and this unforgiving is one waterhole at a time, until one day you look up and realize you have crossed a continent. Sidney Kidman, 1857 to 1935. He owned more land than England. He started with a shilling, the Australian legacy. New episode every week.